You're listening to a podcast from Museum of Contemporary Craft. For more information about exhibitions and programs, visit museumofcontemporarycraft.org.
Thanks for coming. My name is Nicole Nathan, and I'm the Curator of Collections here at the museum. And I wanted to send out a very special thanks to our co-sponsors this evening, Art Jewelry Forum, or AJF, the Rotasa Foundation, and the MFA in Applied Craft and Design, which is a collaborative program between PNCA and Oregon College of Art and Craft. Museum of Contemporary Craft has a long history with contemporary jewelry, and it's pretty much been part of what we do for almost all of our 75-plus year history. A few years ago, we presented the exhibition Touching Warms the Art, and I don't know, probably many of you saw it, but if you hadn't, it was an interactive exhibition of wearable jewelry made from non-precious materials. Visitors were allowed to pick up, handle, play with, interact, and pose with these pieces. They could take their photograph wearing the work, and it was posted on the museum's Flickr site, which is still available. You can still go back and see all those photographs. These pieces, many by makers included in the publication, are now part of the museum's teaching collection, which is right here. Actually, it's in this room. The collection is available for research, study, questions, and if you want to look at it, all you have to do is just let us know, and we can make time for you to do it. It's really an amazing collection of pieces. We take it out every once in a while, and it goes and, does stuff. It's on display. We take more photographs. It was over in the Commons last year, and it's really fun. People really love it. So it's been a great resource that we've gone back to many times, and we really welcome you to take part in it. So if you want to, just let us know, and call us or email us or whatever, and we can set up a time for you. So I want to go ahead and introduce our two speakers tonight. Benjamin Lignel, first trained in philosophy and literature, then in art history at New York University and furniture design at the Royal College of Art in London. He devotes most of his time to creating jewelry, but recently he has also been engaged in curatorial and writing endeavors. Lignel is a co-founder of La Garantie, Association pour le Bijou, and my French is terrible.
Lovely.
A French association with a mission to study and promote jewelry. In this capacity, he co-curated Also Known as Jewelry in 2009, and an exhibition of French contemporary jewelry that toured 7 cities, and helped program and organize the 44th Schmuck Symposium Zimmerhof in 2012 in Germany. He began contributing essays and op-eds to magazines and publications in 2006 and became a member of Think Tank, a European initiative for the applied arts, in 2009. Namita Wiggers is director and chief curator here at Museum of Contemporary Craft, in partnership with Pacific Northwest College of Art. Through curatorial practice, Wiggers considers how craft and design function as subjects and verbs, and simultaneously distinct and intersecting practices, and how the exhibition operates as a site and space for cultural inquiry. Wiggers pursued doctoral studies in art history at the University of Chicago, where she earned her MA. She holds BAs in art history and English from Rice University, and she is a co-founder of the Critical Craft Forum and serves on the board of trustees of the American Craft Council. Namita has many publications, including Generations Betty Phoebus, Ken Shore's Clay Has the Last Word, and Unpacking the Collection, selections from Museum of Contemporary Craft, all from the museum, and has contributed many essays and all kinds of good stuff. She presented the keynote lecture at the Schmuck Symposium Zimmerhof in 2012, and her articles on jewelry include Curatorial Conundrums, Exhibiting Contemporary Art Jewelry in a Museum Environment, and Mining History, Ornamentalism Revisited, from Metalsmith in 2009, co-authored with Lena Vigna. A few last things before we turn it over to our fantastic people here tonight. Please remember that we will have a book signing directly after the talk, and we're going to do that here in the lab. So right here in the lab, if you've got your book, or if you want to, and we're able to purchase them too.
Yes.
Okay. So you can get them signed. Ben and Namita will also be presenting a workshop on Saturday, and there are still 2 spaces left. So if you are interested in signing up for that, It's occupythisworkshop.eventbrite.com. So if anyone is interested, there are spaces left. Also, please note that the museum will be part of Willamette Week's Give Guide this year, which is really exciting. We are really, really psyched to be in that. And it's going to go live on November 6th, 2013. If you don't know what it is, go check it out. They have a Facebook page. And it's really a great opportunity. We pair with a business partner, and it raises money for all different kinds of nonprofits throughout the city and state. But we're excited to be within it this year. So, without any further delays, I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Thanks, everyone. Let's welcome them.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Just a point to remember, if everybody could take your phones out, please, and turn them to the off position so they don't go off, except for Anna, who's going to help time us. And just to remind everybody, when you exit, that you need to exit through the hallway here and go down through the 720 entrance instead of through the museum itself. So with that, before we begin, Ben suggested we find out, just from a show of hands, how many of you make jewelry?
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, you do too. I don't anymore. I gave my torch to the Applied Craft and Design program, so I don't have it anymore. So let me begin, and I will tell you that we are going to try. We both tend to speak rather fast, so we're going to try to slow it down a little bit because it is a pretty rich, dense kind of a talk. So to start with, we want to explain the process of how this publication came into being and our roles in it. We were brought together to create a collaborative section with a number of other writers by Dr. Damian Skinner. And all 5 of us, spent a year corresponding over email, writing essays, sharing thoughts, questions, ideas, and so forth. And then when we convened and went through all the text together, we felt that we were all saying the same things that have been said before. And it seemed a waste of time and effort to have the 5 of us in a room and not actually try to do something different. So we spent a week intensely dissecting our texts, discussing what we thought was valuable, and then figuring out how to take that and turn it into something new. And what we developed is a different strategy. We decided to collaboratively compose sections on the spaces through which jewelry moves, and we'll talk more. Ben will talk more about those specific spaces later on and list them out for you. These space sections in the book, were written collectively. And when you have 5 people around the globe, that's quite an endeavor, and it means that some people are getting up at 7 in the morning and others are getting up at 11 at night to have conference calls. But we did write those collectively, and the intention was to frame a critical strategy for understanding jewelry and to create a framework to introduce keywords. And these keywords were written individually, but collectively responded to. And here, the broader spaces in these keywords are broken down into specific questions and issues that are relevant to the field.
So today we're going to start with the keywords in an effort to sort of break down the linearity of the book. So to underline the fact that this is a book that you can read front to back, but it's also a book that you can take in your hands and start looking at the keywords if you find some that are engaging, and then look at the spaces. And so we'll move through 4 keywords and then deal with 3 spaces.
Afterwards, we'll open up for questions, and Anna is going to have a microphone because we are recording this talk. If you wouldn't mind speaking into the microphone when you ask your questions, please. We'll have a bit of a discussion, and then the book signing, as Nicole mentioned. So we're going to move as quickly as we can, but the images will have the artist's name on them, and if you find there's something you want to know more about, just please feel free to ask us later. And we hope that after the discussion, it will give you a chance to respond to the book and relate it to your own work as well. So do you want to start by explaining the film that we were watching?
So this film was made by Gisbert Stach, a German maker, and I think it was a nice introduction to the first keyword we're going to talk about, which is gender. So the original film, as I said, was 22 minutes. I think it was first projected in 2009, and I saw it for the first time in Zimmerhof.
So traditionally, adornment is most often associated with women, particularly in Western cultures. And despite efforts to shift habits of men to adorn themselves in brooches, and Ben has taken off his jacket, but he was wearing a brooch. Contemporary jewelry remains predominantly female-focused, and this remains a burden for jewelry and for women. So the question that surfaces then is what opportunities exist to better examine and understand gender with regards to contemporary jewelry. Rather than take it as a feminine form at face value, we see it as an opportunity to delve more deeply into the questions of gender.
One of the reasons we wanted to start with this keyword is that it's an issue which is largely untackled by contemporary makers. The question of women's emancipation, the power structures that surround matrimony, figures of role-playing and role assigning do not figure very much into contemporary practice, despite or because of jewelry's long-standing relationship with gender definition. So the story of that emancipation is not something that we find in contemporary jewelry, we find it in fashion. What we have here on the slide is an ad from the 1900s showing, if you want, the typical power structure which is represented in the gift-giving of jewelry. So this is a man offering a piece of jewelry to a woman, which is dressed in a cocktail dress. And then the image on the right is, in the 1970s, a woman who's representing with jewelry that she's probably bought at Barbara Cartledge's gallery in London. And this is the first gallery that introduced ethnic jewelry in the 70s. And she's shown without a man. She doesn't need that man. And so this is how this statement of empowerment trickles down to fashion.
So in the past several decades, whole bodies, no pun intended, of critical theory and literature dedicated to understanding women and the female body in art, society, and critical theory continue to be created, and yet jewelry continues to be dominated by work made by and for the female body without the same level of criticality in other arenas of contemporary art. And here we have a picture, and you can see Jiro Kamata in his workshop, 14 women, 1 man.
And he's doing the teaching.
And he's doing the teaching.
So there are some rare makers, and I'm going to show you a few examples who have tackled and explored the link between contemporary craft and feminine handiwork. So feminine handiwork refers to those activities that were assigned to women from medieval times to, let's say, the mid-20th century. And this is a German maker called Monika Brugger, who's been living in France for about 20 years. In that particular piece, she's taken a definition of the word brooch and she's threaded it into this silk shirt. Now, I think there's a dialogue going on here between craft and conceptual work, and specifically the work of Joseph Kosuth. But there's something also about claiming those feminine activities as part of her practice. A second maker, she's a Swiss maker called Sophia Nagard, also immigrated to France about 20 years ago. This particular piece, which is made out of beer caps, which the story goes were drank by her stepbrother, is called Family Jewels. They hang low. Now, the moral coordinates of that particular piece is going to depend on what you think she's trying to say, your position vis-à-vis gender issues, and who's wearing it. This is a work by one of her students, Carole Deltor, and again, she wanted to reappropriate, in that case, male jewelry types for a feminine use. And this is a mold of her clitoris, which is using as a seal ring.
So, on a more innocuous level, a number of makers have gingerly subverted known archetypes of feminine jewelry, often bringing other issues into the equation, such as the association of femininity with specific archetypes or materials, namely the gemstone, as we see here in this piece by Mikey and Mike, and this piece with pearls by Manon van Koswick, which is soap, and basically you wash the soap away and the pearls continue to reveal themselves.
So the biggest effort that I know about to tackle masculinity and its relationship to jewelry has been the project by Ruud Peters called Lingam. I don't know if you heard about this. So he's invited 110 makers to revisit the Lingam, which is an avatar of Shiva, and this avatar takes the shape of a stone monolith, a phallus. And so 110 makers played on that sort of idea, that object. This is the version or the reinterpretation by French maker Frédéric Braun. It's called Display. I think this show was a bit of a missed opportunity in the sense that most of the responses were objects as opposed to jewelry. So even though it was dealing with masculinity, I don't think it really engaged with men's relationship to jewelry and how that could be impacted.
So considering the potential for sexploration of contemporary jewelry raises a number of questions. How does the field perpetuate the notion of the perfect body? Is this the perfect body? It raises the question of the female body as the perfect form for jewelry, and also whose body and which body needs to be better theorized. Most of the bodies are typically white bodies, young bodies, so race and ethnicity hasn't even begun to be addressed within the whole framework of contemporary jewelry. It also raises the question of the young body versus the old body in terms of who is actually wearing the jewelry.
Some makers, however, have played against type, and what I mean by this is that instead of using the usual young, beautiful woman, they have, for example, in the case of Pia Alborg, been using older models, and this is part of a series called Take Your Seat, and there's a number of pieces like this where she's using a model who's about 60 years old, I guess. The inspiration for that may be those formidable figures of fashion. This is Lady Sitwell on the left. She was a screenwriter working for Hollywood, and the money she made out of her first scenario, she spent on the pieces of jewelry we're seeing here, and then when she died, she asked that she be buried with them. And the lady on the right is Diana Vreeland, who also was a fashion editor, I think.
So given that most of the collectors of contemporary jewelry are, in fact, older women with means, as opposed to those who make contemporary jewelry, the juxtaposition of those making versus, the juxtaposition of those making and creating the image of contemporary jewelry as young, fresh, and now, versus the actual self-adornment of contemporary jewelry by older women, who the media often presents as past their sexual prime, remains another ripe and unexplored area for discursive study. And here we have a piece by Ben, and I'm going to ask Ben to explain this piece and then talk a little about Madeleine Albright's piece.
So this is my mum, and this is called Getting Old Sucks. And it's two brooches that are supposed to be worn at nipple height, and they're oxidized silver. And I wanted to play and work with the idea that men tend to look at women's breasts and what happens when they get past the age of 50. And I wanted this image to be confrontational, so to use this as a way to, I wanted her to be proud in the picture. This has met with various responses, especially from men. The image on the right is Madeleine Albright wearing the peace dove, and we know that her collection of jewelry has been displayed at MAD. And the fact that she's used that jewelry strategically in her political encounter with heads of state.
I believe the project is called Read My Pins.
Yeah.
Right. So moving from that, we're going to step into our second keyword, which is critique of preciousness. I guess that's multiple words, but the keyword idea is critique of preciousness. So why is this important? Well, the stereotypical reaction when you mention jewelry is to assume that the work is composed with and contains precious materials: gold, silver, pearls, gemstones, those materials associated with monetary, historic value, and heritage, things that are passed on. Despite work for decades to shift away from precious materials, jewelry, because of its popular and opulent place in society, remains inextricably linked to particular notions of value and materials. And so here we have an example from a project called The Gold Standard that Lisa Gralnick did. And what she did is she took certain things like a nose job, a violin, a cell phone, and in this case, a Tiffany diamond. And she figured out what the amount of value was, the monetary market value of those things, and then took an equivalent amount of gold for the fair market value of that day and created a piece specifically referencing that original object. And that was her way of getting at this question of the relationship between those objects that we have value and gold itself.
So contemporary jewelry was born in part as a reaction against ostentation, and specifically set out to offer an alternative to luxury jewelry, making value not the purpose, but one of its subject of inquiries. Like recalcitrant children, contemporary jewelers set out to question the characteristics of traditional jewelry. Amongst them were ability, durability, and of course preciousness. So at the root of this territorial expansion is a challenge extended to the wider public to reassess its assumption about what makes jewelry valuable, and in particular its relationship to precious metals and stones. And so this example by Gilles Jonman is a submission from 1975 to a De Beers competition. What he did is buy a wrench off the shelf in a hardware store, and just had a diamond between his jaws, and then send this off to the competition. He actually won. There's a statement in what makes that particular piece valuable. I would propose that what makes it valuable is the gesture, the sort of provocative gesture of saying, I don't need a pavé setting for this to work. And so this is the beginning of shifting the attention from the material value to the artistic position that this person is taking. At the beginning, the goal of the pioneers was to disengage jewelry from its gold standard. While the use of wearable currency has been largely abandoned, jewelry continues to have a singular promiscuity with money. And that's something that I took off the net 2 days ago. This is coin jewelry using, I think, some actual gold coins and then coins that have been manufactured by those people. And so this is something that we immediately associate with jewelry, traditional jewelry anyway, which is how much is it worth? And people continue to carry that, in the theme that it develops. Look at, dollar signs and bling bling and all of that.
So we thought it was important to recognize that there was experimentation before in the 1960s as well. And Alexander Calder experimented with wire and brass and silver. And silver at that time was not considered a precious metal in the same way that it is today. The prices have gone up and skyrocketed. And in addition to that, some of you may know that just recently somebody realized that they had an Alexander Calder they picked up in a yard sale or some kind of thing, and it's going up for auction for exorbitant amounts of money. In addition to that, Annie Albers experimented with materials from local hardware stores as a reaction to her inability to use precious materials during World War II. And these have now been turned into DIY kits that mimic the original, but are now used to support a nonprofit. Marielle, do we still have some downstairs? We have some of these kits downstairs, and I can tell you that my children enjoyed making all of them. And I actually wear them every now and then. More recently, we have the Radical Jewelry Makeover, a mobile community educational project that's directed by Susie Gonch and Christina Miller. And this project calls attention to both the material vocabulary of jewelry, namely precious materials, and the excessive damage of mining on the earth. Participants donate loads of jewelry, which is separated by personal stories, materials, etc., and then the jewelry is reconfigured into new work by Susie, Christina, and a host of volunteer jewelers from each of the communities on the project sites.
So the conventional techniques used in traditional jewelry have been in turn largely bracketed by the purpose of the status jewelry. So it's been about making it shine and making it visible from afar. So a cynic would say those techniques and the flourishes they're capable of are an alibi behind which hides the simple expression of wealth.
And I chose this particular piece to represent this idea and explain to Ben that growing up in Texas, all the ladies who lunched and all the junior league ladies had David Yurman bracelets. It was what you graduated from James Avery when you were in middle school and high school to your David Yurman after you finished your college years.
And that's what I grew up with. So critique of preciousness happens on at least two fronts. It's an ideological battle against cultural habits, on the one hand, and it takes the form of a formal exploration of new technical and material territories on the other. And what I mean by this is that as soon as you leave this purpose, the idea of making it look precious and using those materials and those techniques, they need to invent your own materials and your own techniques. And this is an early piece by Paul Doré, and he's the owner of Gallery Ra in Amsterdam. And this is a piece, I think, from 1975, where he mixes the use of plastic with the use of silver.
So, putting the idea of preciousness into question, past the early dogmatic stage, does not necessarily translate into saying that precious materials are bad. It is about proposing new allegiances with performance, fine arts, photography, etc., suggesting that the use of gold should not be atavistic and that choosing pertinent materials is how contemporary jewelry engages the world.
This is a ring by a French maker called Maud Traon. She trained in France and then moved to London and went to the Royal College. The work that she did for her degree show was using the wrapping from crisp packages, and so she would burn these and melt them, and they would retain some of the glitter of that package, and then part of it would be just completely remelted. She then moved on to Fimo. Do you say Fimo? Fimo? On which she would apply glitter. And the rings that she's doing now can be as tall as this, and they always include glitter, sometimes ponies, sometimes dolls. And they tend to fall off as you wear them. But it's, I understand it's part of the thing. So the narrative of Critique of Preciousness is about shifting the determination of value over to alternative value system, making authorship and the willingness to sail uncharted territories the new hallmark of its worth. So ultimately, Critique of Preciousness became a critical template. It spelled out a way to oppose traditional jewelry in different forms. And so what I'm suggesting is that the critique of skill that happens later on used the Critique of Preciousness as one of its templates. So if the first moments of the Critique of Preciousness were oppositional, then it soon became strategic. The second generation of makers who are using non-precious material are not necessarily opposing preciousness. They're just using, as you said today, that space that was created by the first generation to say, okay, I want to play in that area. But I don't think it's necessarily still against preciousness. In that case, this is a work by Namita Gupta, which was just exhibited at Marseille in Holland from this year. And she's hand-carved a chopping board into a color. So I think there's something different at stake here. She's using wood and she's using craft, but she's not necessarily against the whole traditional jewelry.
We were talking earlier about how this is similar to what happens in the shift when you go from feminists in the 1960s to feminist practices today, or when you think about artists that participated in Thelma Golden's Black Male show that was at the Whitney in the mid-90s, and then several years later she revisited the work of the next generation, and there were there was, as you said, there were different issues at stake, so the work functions and enters the dialogue in a very, very different place. So the tension for me as a curator with this is, how do I engage and educate an audience that has not yet moved with contemporary makers into a conversation that is even about the critique of preciousness? And this is a piece from Touching Warms the Art by Emiko Oye, and it's made out of Lego. It's a parure, so you can take it apart and make it into earrings or different kinds of necklaces, which of course ties in beautifully with the playfulness and the manipulative, I can't even say this, manipulatability, I've got an extra syllable in there, of Lego itself. But, as Ben was saying, there are new allegiances within the field that are clear. But the question I have is, are they as clear and visible outside of this internal conversation that we might have within the contemporary jewelry world itself, or within the broader world of craft? And what can curators do to make that more explicit? How can artists make that more explicit in communities where the conversation hasn't yet transpired to the same place?
I think we should just pause for a second. Are we going too fast?
Too slow? Okay, just try. Little bear. It's a baby bear. All right, that's good. We were worried we were going to go too fast. So the next keyword we want to talk about is inheritance. And so what about inheritance? Why is transmission from generation to generation a critical issue for contemporary jewelry? Well, in part because of the expectation of preciousness, materials. The assumption is that jewelry is where a family, or more specifically a woman, carries wealth. Traditionally, jewelry is the evidence of wealth and status. Think about dowries or royal jewels. And this is linked to history, to the history of the family and its ongoing status, or loss of status, in terms of jewels being passed down or sold to pay bills and then lost to family lore. In the Victorian era, we became introduced to the idea of the family jewels, which emerged as a reference, of course, to male genitalia as the marker and location of familial heritage. With contemporary art jewelry's connection to art since the 1960s, and not necessarily to precious materials with understood broad cultural value, value in terms of such objects is then perceived in a vastly different manner than with traditional jewelry.
As we saw, Critique of Preciousness has made a point of resisting identification with monetary currency. It's tried to shift the notion of value away from weight, and weight in metal and stone specifically, towards artistic value. And we know how difficult it is to assess exactly what that value is. So how does being art impact the way that we perceive and pass on this jewelry?
Thinking about passing on this jewelry, it raises the question about the life cycle of the object itself. The jewelry object reveals opportunities for the field and places where the field struggles. There's an opportunity to explore this in terms of the path from childhood to adult, and in terms of broader cultural associations. And here is where my own interest in anthropology and the object as a cultural artifact may diverge somewhat from those of the concerns of a maker. And this, to me, is epitomized in the luxury watch ads that proclaim, you never really own a Patek Philippe, you merely look after it for the next generation. In contemporary art jewelry's connection to art and its simultaneous connection to traditional understanding of jewelry is a complex relationship that can be at odds with one another. Contemporary jewelry is neither one thing nor the other, but both things at the same time.
So the shift from one set of value, weight, to another, creativity, creates an interesting conflict when dealing with the idea of transmission. So if it's a family heirloom, its value will increase as it is passed on from father to son. The more wear, the more history, and the more emotional weight, if you will. If it is an artwork, however, transmitting really means preserving. Whether in private or public hands, the value of an artwork hinges on its capacity to resist to resist the test of time, both artistically and physically. So the shift from one set of value to another also changes the way we interact with that work. Family jewelry is activated through use by a few. Artworks are activated through contemplation by many. In reality, contemporary jewelry wants to be both a private asset and a public property. So this is one of the conflicts that makes it interesting, and there's a few makers who've tried to play on that idea. And this example is a piece by Norwegian maker Nana Melland called Swarm, and she's put up, I think, 5,500 of these small laser-cut airplanes in a museum. And I think in this first installation, people could just come and pick it up. And so you had a first public encounter with the work, which was in a public space, and big opening, a few hundred people came, and then you would pick up that airplane, bring it home, and then it would start to function as a private object on which you could project whatever, which was informed by the fact it had been a public object to begin with, but then would shift over to the private sphere.
And I thought it would be good to mention that Hilary Pfeiffer created an installation that was installed both at our institution and at the Fuller Craft Museum with a very similar name, different punctuation. But Hilary is not a jewelry maker, and yet the way that her work operated is in a very similar way, in that you could purchase one or two or more of the love bugs that she had created, and rather than wearing them or adorning yourself with them or adorning your private spaces with them, in the same way as the jewelry, they really operated in more of an she likes to put things in places that calls your attention to the architecture of the space. But there are a lot of people who give Hilary a hard time about whether her work functions in that never land between jewelry and other kinds of objects, and we can argue about that with her another time. Good, she's laughing. Shoo. The circulation of jewelry between generations is complicated when value is shifted from materials to artistic concept. Susan Beach shares a story of inheriting jewelry with the women in her family, from the women in her family. And these were not pieces that she wanted to wear. They didn't reflect her personal identity and sense of self. Adorning herself in works such as Ruth Peters' Lingam Ring establishes her own personal sense of expression and identity. However, there is no guarantee that future family recipients of a piece like this will appreciate it for artistic merit over monetary value.
So one of the issues is that the value of a collection resides also in the fact that a collector such as Susan Beach may have accumulated specific historical pieces by someone. She will have probably put together some prospectus, catalogs, information from the gallery, from the artist directly. Now, that defines the value of her collection, and if that collection is then broken up into pieces, whatever is around that, all the documentation that she's put together will disappear, will get lost in transmission.
And in this transmission from one kind of private collection to another private collection or multiple collections, as Ben is describing, as well as in the efforts to transmit private collections to public institutions, contemporary jewelry remains at risk. Very few museums collect contemporary jewelry. There is no secondary market for contemporary jewelry, and even the primary market is limited in the United States. There are very few galleries and spaces offering such work for exhibition, consumption, collection. Exposure is primarily through photographs and print media or on the internet. And while there are a number of colleges and universities at which the making of contemporary jewelry is part of the curriculum, the lack of venues to share the work doesn't help current or future generations engage, understand, appreciate, or even theorize this kind of object. So if contemporary jewelry is to survive the cycle of inheritance, it must move beyond its immediate community into the broader population through multiple channels.
Skill, simple subject. So skill describes both the technical know-how of a jeweler and that jeweler's ability to invent solutions. So it's both an asset and a potential. Skill is also one of the foundation, the so core values of traditional craft, which in turn has shaped how contemporary jewelers define themselves. And like most of craft's core values, that too has come under attack by contemporary jewelers. One of the things that we'd like to talk about is de-skilling. De-skilling means leveraging the tension between conventional forms and conventional methods to expand the definition of artistic skill and encompass new forms of competence. And so the ring that we're looking at is Carl Fritz's work has always been used to sort of describe de-skilling. Now, this is a man who is using old techniques, in that case, claw setting, but doing it in a way which is not speaking the language of traditional jewelry. So de-skilling is both a reaction against and an endorsement of technical skill. The work of Carl, I think, is not understandable or meaningful if you don't know what's next to it. So whatever he's doing on the left doesn't make sense if you don't know what's happening on the right. And so de-skilling is in this sort of hate-love relationship with skill, with something it's referencing and that it needs to give it power. The other interesting point is that, again, like the critique of preciousness, de-skilling is about shifting what we pay attention to when we look at a piece of jewelry away from what traditionally gives it value, which is, the way it's made and, the know-how and the learning that goes into it, towards artistry. So it's about replacing one set of value, again, by another one, authorship and an artistic gesture.
And it seems important to re-emphasize here that this is not a new thing in the art arena, and skill is, in fact, currently a hot topic again in academic circles. For example, John Roberts' book, The Intangibilities of Form, Skill and De-Skilling in Art After the Ready-Made, examines the expansion of artistic authority in avant-garde art in recent centuries through a labor theory of culture. He and others raise questions that are particularly relevant to jewelry, such as how is skill theorized and evaluated when seemingly absent in modern and contemporary art? How does this work in terms of contemporary jewelry, where even the most abject object is subjected to both avant-garde theories and questions of skill because of the history of labor of this category of objects? More specifically, theorizing the Duchampian ready-made and the jewelry handmade.
So makers who question the importance of recognizable technical skills in craft are to some extent less dependent on a recognizable signature technique. This is a good example. This is work by Mia Maljojoki from Finland, trained in Munich. And this is a work from, I think, 3 years ago. She's using plaster and fabric with paint. And the work on the right is very recent. She's using ceramic and fabric. She's also done performances, and she's done sort of garment-looking things. So she's a good example of someone who, because she's not tied to a particular technique, she will move from one to the next. A good example of the definition of the artist of someone who is good at nothing but capable of everything. At the other extreme, still within contemporary jewelry, there's someone like Giovanni Corvaja, who's famous for what I would call hypermaking. So he's been developing for the last few years a series of pieces called fleeces, where he's drawn gold to point something of a millimeter, and he's made fur and fabric out of this gold. And so in the narrative that accompanies his work, it always emphasizes the single-minded determination to overcome a tremendous technical challenge. And this is, his jewelry goes always with that discourse.
So we really do want to emphasize that de-skilled is by no means unskilled. Those authors of the rough and formless are often very proficient technicians. Unskilled is a position, a posture, and figure of emancipation that chooses to advertise certain qualities over others.
So pieces like the ones we saw by Mia or the ones by Giovanni inhabit different skill planets. And this has several implications. One of them is that they will have different criteria for success. They also carry different sort of proofs. One of them will be signed and the other will be assayed. And they're also likely to have different distribution networks. What? You want the time? Oh, sorry.
Good. So with the...
It's 7:19.
So with the introduction into the field of other technological modes of production, namely 3D printing, this shakes things up even further as questions of skill, de-skill, reskill, and production versus handmade come into play. For art historians, this lends yet another layer on top of everything else. Now is time to figure out how to add 3D technology into this. And the idea is not to assess solely what can be made through this newer process, because many of you know Stanley Lexthen has been working in 3D printing and digital printing for quite a number of years in Philadelphia. But to ask the question of what are the terms by which this work needs to be evaluated? How are we to understand it? What are the distinguishing factors to determine skill when new modes of making take hold?
But I would argue that skill for makers is something that describes a broad range of things, of activities. There are other skills: entrepreneurial, promotional, curatorial, pedagogical. And this is not a conversation that we're going to go into tonight, but the fact that contemporary makers are doing all these things is pushing the envelope of what this craft is about or this practice is about. If you're putting a show together, if you're labeling your work, captioning or writing a text, are you still doing craft? So this is I think, very exciting and also very problematic, because my experience of this field is that you tend to make the work and then you package it and then you write about it, you set up the exhibition, and then maybe you buy the work yourself. And there's a bit of an issue then when we're making for our own and writing about it ourselves.
I would have to concur, and Ben has skipped saying that this is only a slight exaggeration, and I would agree that it is only a slight exaggeration. So as curators, what is being sought in terms of representing skill-based work within the museum? For decorative arts curators, this means assessing skill differently than it might for contemporary art curators. I have this conversation all the time with my colleagues at major museums. The big collecting museums are looking at work sometimes very differently than I am. Historicizing skill in terms of tools and access at the moment is different from evaluating innovation and conceptual practices that push boundaries differently in contemporary work. Skill is not just an issue for how the maker works or how the work is made, but also for how the work is presented, framed, communicated through the object, through the text, through the scenography, when the maker is not present, i.e. in the white cube.
To conclude this keyword on skill, I'm going to show the work of Atai Shen that was presented in Munich, I think about 4 years ago. And I think this piece is interesting because it encapsulates both an almost nostalgic relationship to skill and a very conceptual attitude to making. So he has used an ounce of gold to represent the blooming of a flower. So he took that and then he made that piece, melted it, made that one, melted it, and made that one. And there's 4 sets of those sort of evolutions of a plant. And between each of those states, he would redo the piece from scratch. The actual thing that was on display in the exhibition in Munich was this MP4 player with an ounce of gold next to it. So none of these pieces ever stayed as an object. And so on the one hand, he's sort of doing an incredible homage to making and, you know, the skills that go into that work. And on the other hand, he's doing quite a clever sleight of hand about what it is to become a conceptual or contemporary maker. Quite problematic, that piece. It's called The Redundancy of Matter.
So now we're going to move into the spaces.
Yeah.
And with that, I just want to remind you that the keywords were words that each of us chose the keywords. We actually compiled the list of keywords together, argued, debated, went back and forth on what the list actually needed to be. And then we chose the words that we wanted to work on or were assigned the words by Damian, who was editing the publication. But we all responded to those keywords. So we started with those in a way starting from individual position that was also collectively addressed. And we didn't publish anything in the final book without all of us engaging in a conversation about the keywords.
No, but the keywords were probably a bit more subjective in their position than the spatial text.
Absolutely. So that's a great way to start. Let's explain what the spatial text was.
So there are 7 spaces that we have identified, and the gist of this theoretical part of the book is to propose, to look at jewelry and the spaces that it inhabits. The spaces have very literal names. It's the bench, the page, the plinth, the drawer, the body, the street, and the world. And these very literal names refer to a variety of non-literal things. So at once there's a real thing, so an actual physical page, and at the same time, it's the no less real condition or setup that informs that object. So to take an example, what's happening now, so the fact that we're talking to you and describing this book and speaking about jewelry, for us would be part of the page, because we're collectively thinking about jewelry and creating discourse around it. So in the book, in the sort of grid that we propose, this is the page. And so today we're going to talk about 3 of these spaces. The first one is the page, then the plinth, and finally the body. So what happens in page? The page is a record, a historical trace. This is the sort of old school function of books, as the things that substitute themselves to individual memory. This may not be where something is first seen, but it may be the last trace and the only trace we have of it. It's also a field of action, noting and celebrating people and objects, a sort of scoreboard of original moves. This is where artists publicize their inventions in the monograph or the exhibition catalogue, but also disseminate things whose existence is too brief or too intimate to make public. 2 examples of that, this is called Hand Mirror by Otto Künstler, and this is Mercury. And this is a series called Automaten Photos, which is like, how do you call this thing where you sit in photo booth? And so he did a number of things which would be like performances with no witnesses, where he would take pictures of himself wearing bits of string or objects. And then the things that would be exhibited would be the images and never the actual object as propositions.
So for the curator, the page is the space through which the ideas behind the concept of an exhibition are put on public view. The documentation of the temporal presentation essays that provide context, images that include and expand those of the objects that are on view, etc. It becomes the trace, whether in print or online, of the actual exhibition itself. This trace, the space of the page, is no longer merely a page in a book or magazine. The page is a space which appears in print, website, smartphone app, etc.
And the game changer for us makers is that this digital page, this space that where we disseminate our images, doesn't have as a gatekeeper the publisher, so we can choose and decide whatever we want to put on there. And so it's the authority over that space is shared.
And with that authority, it's important to understand that numerous online services offer websites that are rich with images and content. And here, with these kinds of websites, the page provides access. It makes work that would be otherwise restricted to hard-to-find and costly print publications available across geographic and national boundaries. These websites create community through the page. Think Benedict Anderson's Imagine Communities on crack. However, curators still, do you guys know Benedict Anderson's Imagine Communities? Okay, so Imagine Communities was a publication that was read quite a bit in the 1990s in particular. And it's the idea that mechanisms like the newspaper created a sense of community across the globe, because you could be in Australia and you could be in London and you could read the same story within a few short hours. So it brought the whole world together, basically. So, however, curators are still stuck in many ways in particular modes of documentation and presentation, in print and on the internet. There are many invested parties with whom a curator must negotiate: artists, collectors, graphic designers, funders, writers, institutional branding, etc. The list goes on. I can assure you that though you may think curators have extensive control over the presentation of content in print and digital pages, the truth is that very few curators do. I've been really lucky working in a very small museum where we do get to have a little bit more say, but for the most part, I think that that's pretty rare. But it's something I very much appreciate. Curators have a say in terms of content at most places, in terms of the verbiage, but not necessarily in the way in which the page itself is delivered. So this is both a limitation and a marker from which there's an opportunity for change to take place.
I'd say that the position of makers is more open in the sense that what I see is makers taking control of that space and using photography, amongst other things, to say something about their practice. And the types of photography that we see of contemporary jewelry harnesses different styles, from neighboring fields. One of them is fashion, and this is work by Noon Passama, where she's using a code of the sort of more fringy sort of fashion magazine like Purple. Like you've got a more sculptural approach, and this is a piece by Fabrizio Tridenti, which gives you no sense of scale, no reference to the fact that it's a wearable piece. It could be an Anthony Caro sculpture. And so in that case, for me, he's using the visual strategy of the white plinth, translated into the page. And in fact, it's difficult, he doesn't engage me and doesn't make me want to think about this as a piece of jewelry. So there's an element of manipulation in what's happening on that page. And then there's this sort of...
Whoops.
There's that.
And now we pause for a technical problem. Hold on one second.
Thanks for coming to this rehearsal. Yeah?
Here.
So let's...
This one?
No, that one.
Sorry. Are we up? Yes.
Very sensitive computer. Okay, so this is a work by Nathalie Perret where she's designed a necklace which is made out of cushions filled with plaster, and it's really a performance where she puts it on and takes it off, and it leaves traces on her dress. Now, there for me, she's using the sort of documentary strategy of photography, that we've been seeing since the 60s. And so it's interesting that all these makers appropriate these visual styles to say something about how they work. So it's less a negotiation, and I'm thinking about what Namita was saying, with different partners. It's more an annexation. It's more a question of taking control of that space. One of the reasons for that is that publishers now seldom put up money for publications, which means that makers, why not do it on their own? This is a book by Volker Atrops, which is photocopied on sort of slightly metallic paper. A very distinctive style. It probably didn't cost very much, but he had complete control over the publication. Similarly, some makers are ganging up with photographers. This is a work by Denise Julia Rayton from Germany, and she has, all of her projects are beautifully photographed. And there's a lot to be said about the way that she's controlling that space and using that photography to say something about the work that she does, and also how she wants to sell it.
So thinking about this in terms of co-publishing and printing and so forth, it raises questions for me as a curator and an art historian, because it seems to me that these projects that result from self-publication in this manner are in danger of residing somewhere between self-documentation and vanity, meaning that the historical record being created through this manner of activating the page needs to be understood in terms of how it deliberately shapes the historic record and discourse, and how it's theorized in terms of broader practices. And that's not to say that museums aren't certainly doing the same thing also, but it does, I do think it's important for us to have diversity and a range of kinds of practices and recognize this as a new, very particular kind of self-documentation.
I mean, it's a bit more than that, in the sense that some makers have really used a page as a space of production. And I want to compare these two catalogs. So on the right is a project by Manon von Koeswijk, the person who did the soap with the pearl necklace. She has cut out, this is a long project called Lepidoptera domestica, where she's cut out butterflies out of utensils, domestic utensils. And then she's installed them in sort of exhibition spaces, artists in residence, those type of things. And she made a publication to go with that. Now, the photography speaks the language of installation art, and this is what she claims. The work on the left is the work of Karin Johansson from Sweden, and she's also been working on butterflies, but she very much claims a space, a skill in making and a types of research on the surface of these butterflies. And so she is more, going in the direction of Fabrizio Tridanti, which is to present this and make me consume it as if it was a painting on a white wall. And so same subject by people of the same age who know about one another, using very different strategies in the page to say something about who they are and how they define their practice. Another example is Suska Makert, who's probably the founding mother of conceptual jewelry. This is a work where she's taken I think an auction catalog, and she's removed all the information about the jewelry apart from the caption. And so what you're looking at is a book with white pages and just the text saying, this is a pair of earrings from 18th century with blue sapphires.
So to conclude this space, I wanted to return to just a brief discussion of photography. Photography through the page functions as the most common way in which contemporary jewelry is experienced. The page itself merits serious critical attention. A photograph offers constructive fictional experiences with the jewelry object. On a simple level, for example, both sides of a brooch may be viewed simultaneously, an experience that can't happen in reality. Manipulation of scale on the page, particularly through photography, permits a large sculpture and a small piece of jewelry to maintain equal status and spatial strength. So by examining how the page functions and what elements can be structured, I can't help but wonder how we might better understand the specificities of the field, and more importantly, engage the page in the service of communicating that difference.
Does that make sense to you, this idea that the page is a place where you're producing something? We're getting nods. Good.
Okay, we have two more. Should we pick it up, or are you guys okay? It's good? Okay. It's a big book.
Yeah. We rehearsed this talk with 37 minutes. We're now on an hour and 5 minutes, so that's something that's... Anyway, go on then.
The plinth. So with the plinth, we want to talk about strategies of display first, and I think you were going to start with
No, you were going to start.
Schumacher. Oh, I'm starting this one?
Yeah, look, it's green.
Okay, so we're going to talk about strategies of display first and the question of presenting. So with that, we wanted to expand the notion of the plinth. I mean, traditionally we think about the plinth as this very particular thing, the white cube, that horrid, okay, I shouldn't say horrid. I find that white cube to be horrid, that we always keep putting things on out in the museum space. So we wanted to introduce the idea of other kinds of ways of thinking about the plinth. And we did this a bit in the book, which you can see, where we thought about a construction site as a plinth, or the street as a plinth, or debates where some of the pictures that ended up in other sections in the spaces that we wanted in our section and lost the fight on ended up in those sections. So look very carefully at the images in the book, and you'll see that there actually are lots of different ways about thinking about the plinth as a space for the presentation, for the strategies that we call scenography or that involve display. So within the museum or the gallery setting, the plinth refers to the toolkit of devices employed by curators for the display of objects, craft and non-craft alike. And it serves to detach the work from its immediate surroundings and to suspend it for our close observation. The environment within which that this happens is important, it matters. A museum display in which work is enshrined in a series of brightly lit cases, for example, turns the work into a Wunderkammer or a cabinet of curiosities, and turns the contemporary jewelry into anthropological or archaeological artifacts. And what you see here are two images. One is an installation at the Manil collection of large-scale African sculpture, and the other is a very small, surreptitiously taken photograph of the installation of Helen Drott's Ornament as Art installation inside the small, brightly lit case, and it's just basically the same kind of thing. It's presented in miniature. So as a museum curator, the staging, or the ways in which works are put on display, is contingent on the intersection of a few critical things: artist intent and goals, curatorial intention and goals, and institutional brand and identity.
As an artist, the first priority used to be to get the best spot in an exhibition, right? This is changing. This is changing because more and more jewelers are thinking about the context and how they show their work. However, I think that most students of jewelry are not taught how to occupy that particular space. And the role of the curator, and again, there's not very many curators trained to be curators of jewelry, is that, all the more important. And so by placing contemporary jewelry behind glass, the properties of that jewelry shifts, pushing the use value of jewelry into the realm of the object of contemplation that typically resides in a museum or gallery.
So by shifting jewelry into a class of autonomous objects, phenomenal experiences and kinesthetic knowledge are denied. And these are important when you're talking about jewelry. As contemporary jewelry belongs to a class of objects where understanding is often contingent on touch, this results in a double distancing. And there are particular conventions and givens that we work with, for example, to highlight the sculptural elements of a work.
Yeah, you're not making the transition very easy then, because you did. Okay. Thank you for coming to this rehearsal.
Sorry. Do you want me to make it easier?
No, that's fine. I'm just going to jump a few lines.
Okay.
So the notion of the white cube is something that we need to talk about when we speak about the way we place as makers jewelry into museums. So this white cube is inherited from contemporary fine art, and it describes a display convention that consists in placing objects in a white, evenly lit, rectilinear space. So it was originally thought as a way to protect the art world from the noise of the outside world and give it a neutral background. Now, this idea that it was neutral then came under attack in the 70s, and specifically in a book by O'Doherty called The White Cube, I think, as a far from neutral space, meant to subtract from the artwork all cues that interfere with the fact that it is art. The emptiness of the white cube, he writes, and the separation between an in, the gallery, and in out, the street, are powerful tools that help the sacramental ritual of turning things into art. And this space thrives on inanimation. And this is a series of pictures by Andy Freeberg that he took in 2007, I think, showing the reception desk in art galleries, mainly in New York. And so I think it gives us a good idea of what that space is like in terms of animation. Now, the problem of contemporary jewelry is that it moves in and out. When it moves in and out of the museum, is not exactly the same as the problem facing art.
And to the extent that contemporary jewelry is wearable, curators must contend with the absence of a real or imagined body in their exhibitions. As a result, the practice of jewelry display or scenography is shaped by the notion that fundamentally displays lie, or at best are incomplete, since they transform the quote-unquote natural perception of the object by removing the body. And in fact, that ties into the title of this particular exhibition that you see here, called The Thinking Body.
So the short history of contemporary jewelry display has been about our relationship to the body. Do we want to put it there, or do we want to remove it from there? Is it an opportunity to remove the body, or is it going to do a disservice? This is an example of a project, collaborative project between Helen Britton, the Australian maker, with a garment designer and a photographer. And so she's got her jewelry not only on those stockmen, those statues, those mannequins, on the actual garments, but also represented in the photographs. And so this is a case where she's decided to multiply the body and make sure that it is a reference for the consumption of her work. The other difference between the way that contemporary jewelers and fine artists deal with the white cube comes from the fact that when, for example, we decide to incorporate into the white cube the shop or the flea market, we're basically quoting other areas where jewelry is happening. And so this is Op Voorraad, which means in stock, which is a pop-up store project by two Dutch and one German makers. And they have invited people to send in multiples, editions of 5, and they would create a pop-up space in different cities around the world. It would be packaged under those transparent blisters and really emulate the sort of physical quality of a hardware store. Some other people have used, I don't know how you call these, that you have in the underground where you put your DVDs on something that you can lift up if the cops come around. Do you have a name for that? Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. Yes? No? Okay, so...
It's not so much an issue in the
Europe,
States.
maybe?
Yeah, I mean, imagine No, it's more like you're selling. Well, it's more like you're selling things illegally. So you create some kind of a structure, for a quick getaway, so you can scoop it and go.
This black thing in the middle is 2 straps that you can lift up if the cops come around, and all your DVDs fall into the thing, and you can walk away. Which doesn't make sense if you don't have problems of selling things illegally in the underground. I realize that. Okay, so anyways, this was used in a show where it was used as a prop for showing contemporary jewelry. This is not as disruptive as when Claes Oldenburg reproduces a shop inside the MoMA in New York. What we're doing when we're doing this is saying, we can integrate or import into the white cube the other sort of selling venues where jewelry actually does happen. Mm-hmm. So it's not as provocative as when people turn museum into shops.
So this intersection between the known and the everyday and the museum and other kinds of spaces is where it also can lead us into a discussion of craft. And as a curator, my strategy has been to challenge these notions. And these are images from Touching Warms the Art, the exhibition that we did in 2008, which, as Ben has pointed out to me on numerous occasions, creates a space that is not quite one thing or another, and so it raises critical questions about authorial intent. Specifically, what Ben has pointed out to me, and we haven't quite resolved this debate, is the fact that it creates a new kind of experience that isn't the gallery, isn't the marketplace, isn't the art fair, isn't the museum, what am I missing, isn't the bench. It's something very contrived and constructed, and so
I was saying that you were
different.
creating an encounter that doesn't happen elsewhere.
Okay.
Anyway, we're still debating this. So the question that we must address as makers is what is gained by using this or that exhibition strategies. Some people have decided that the museum is okay and they're going to use it as a sort of permanent place of exile. And, oops, don't have that image. Others have tried to exit the museum, and there's more and more projects that have to do with meeting the disenfranchised public. And I'm thinking about people in Australia, in Holland, and in America who are doing street performances or are doing sort of demonstrations in the street, wherein, schools do that more and more, where they go, whether in marketplaces or in museums, and they wear the jewelry and they engage with people. The middle ground between those two things, between inhabiting the museum and going on the street to meet the user, describes most of us. And I would say there's two types of way of dealing with that. Some people are letting that decision be taken by someone else, the curator. And others have tried to make impactful and sometimes quite meaningless scenographical statements. And I'm going to show you two images within the same exhibitions to try to explain what I'm saying. So this is an exhibition in 2001 by a group of 4 makers trained by Künstler in Munich, and they go by the collective name of Rebellen der Liebe, so rebels of love. And now one of the problems we have when we're showing a piece of jewelry which is that big in an exhibition space which is that big is what you do with all that space. So what they did here is that they created this sort of half-pipe skating ring to occupy that space, and they've, very cleverly put the brooches on top of that thing. This has no relevance to their work, okay? So it's an interesting statement physically, and one of the good things about it is that this curve meant that you couldn't come too close to the work, so it was almost its own sort of defense mechanism. That was clever, but I'm not sure that I understand why, they bring in this sort of streetwear connotation when they're speaking about trophies in the case of Alexander Black. The space they had was huge, so they had another room, which was about the size of this room, and this is what they did in it. And that I thought was great. So they had curtained off the whole room. So imagine that, there was a curtain going from there to there, using those blankets, that you use in marathons at the end. And they actually had a very small cabinet in the janitor's sort of room at the end of that, where there was just a small space with a small piece of jewelry. And so you would walk through that corridor, and as you walk down it, those blankets would move, and the experience was quite spectacular. And so I thought, in that case, yes, it has to do, it adds to my perception of their work.
Which, for me as a curator, raises the question about whether we curators are being lazy in our acceptance of exhibition tropes and systems. What could we contribute to the dialogue, especially in terms of engagement with our public visitors and the experiences of museum exhibitions? Where could curatorial practitioners, in collaboration with makers and in collaboration with other curators, redefine exhibition practices that accentuate and problematize the plinth? If we understand the page to be a negotiated space between designer, publisher, shaping the look, and the writers, curators, photographers, and artists shaping the content, then how might this help us rethink the plinth as a negotiated space between the contexts of the museum, the high street, the street fair, as well as the artistic intent and curatorial agency to better employ scenography in the plinth to communicate with audiences?
So in short, dealing with that challenge of how to show jewelry is going to impact the way people perceive your work, depending on whether you do, the half pipe or or use simple cabinets or use something that emulates the shop. It's going to tell people who come to see your work how to look at it. This is how we assert the autonomy of contemporary jewelry from other value systems, and namely the value of traditional jewelry.
So last but not least, the body. The body is the expected location of jewelry. There are places on the body which we know are customarily open for adornment. The body is the site for your ears, your jaw, your earrings, your hands, your digits, and these are populated by rings and earrings and things like that. There's an opportunity where today we have an opened arena for previously marginal or ancient traditions to also enter the scope of contemporary jewelry practice, like tattooing and scarification. And there are less obvious sites for jewelry, such as the nose, ear tops, eyebrows, even teeth, as hosts for jewelry. There can also be occasions where jewelry is off the body entirely, but references the body simply through form or cultural signifiers.
So like preciousness, contemporary jewelers have played the game of disappointing our expectations, and one way to do that is to displace jewelry to unusual sites. This is work by Joanne Grimont-Pré from France, and this is a sort of colony of pods that you can place on the shoulder or wherever, and there's another variance where you have you have different sub-pods that go in different places. Likewise, makers have played with assumptions, occupying a well-known site to give flesh to something that's not quite there. And this is the work by Tiffany Palms. Blister ring.
So in relation to objects, we understand certain types of objects, categories of objects to be rings. These go on the digits of the finger, relate to the hand. They can also fuse with the hand, i.e. ubiquitous objects such as wedding bands that are more fleshy, are more than flesh and more than simply jewelry on top of a finger. The body itself is also a factor. The body functions as a tool. It's the means by which jewelry is made. Yet once the object is complete, the maker's body disappears entirely, and the focus is only on the object itself. The absent body, once an object is placed on the plinth, the body becomes an abstract idea. And then there's also the portable plinth, where, if worn, the wearer's body functions as portable display.
So this transfer between the hands of the maker to those of the wearer is paralleled by another reciprocal transfer. Wearing someone's work attests to his or her competence as a maker. It does not make him a jeweler or her a jeweler, but it does confer status and recognition. So there's an unspoken do ou des. I give you, and I give something to you, give something back. It goes beyond the exchange of money for the object, and it can be described as an endorsement. And the word endorsement literally means to put something on your back. So to put something on your back is to approve of someone's work.
There are two different trajectories. Each bring out relationships between the body and the object. With jewelry as an embodied practice, there's a lot of room for exploration. When you consider the body as a living display, the body is not merely a destination with contemporary jewelry, it is a reference point and a vehicle. The history of contemporary jewelry is a pendulum that swings between being a platform or a surface upon which jewelry is located and a space or an environment where jewelry refuses to be integrated with the body, i.e. it becomes an over-adornment upon the body versus something that disappears into the body itself. And this calls attention, too, to the divide between the corporeal and the conceptual.
And that's nice. I think it sort of illustrates that quite nicely. This is a piece by Kim Burke called "It's the Thought That Counts," and so it's a double set where you've got diamonds in a groove in a box, which obviously you cannot wear. The space of the body complicates perception but activates the object in a transformative way. So some work will need the body to be activated. Other work doesn't need the body and doesn't want the body in the picture. And this is, we're back to the example like Fabrizio Tridenti's work. This is a piece by Simon Cottrell, which for me looks as if it were a Frank Stella sort of piece. It's an exercise in form making in space that makes no reference to the body, doesn't want it there. He never uses the body in his pictures. He doesn't want to call attention to it, and therefore it's not part of his practice.
So then how can we better understand the relationship between the body and the object, particularly as a curator when I'm trying to present something to you, and how can I communicate that to someone who isn't particularly familiar with that? If we consider the body as simultaneously a space versus a platform, and a space and a platform, then we can clear a space for consideration of contemporary jewelry as unique, conceptual, and corporeal objects. How then could we understand this unique set of objects that function between these areas of known and perceived or intended space?
The visual strategies, when we're going back to that, of the makers sometimes perpetuate the disconnect that exists in fashion between the ideal wearer, and this would be the ideal wearer. So this is Jennifer Trask on the left-hand side, and this is a page from Vanity Fair with the actress Atherton. And so, in that case, she's using an ideal body, some destination that looks good, very sexualized in both cases. And there's a sort of disconnect between that and the actual wearer. On the left-hand side is a picture by Martin Parr for Cartier. And on the right-hand side is a project by Marseille Gallery. And this is Marseille herself wearing a piece by Plantide. And she's asked collectors to pose wearing a piece that they'd bought. And so there's a bit of a divide there, and interesting that some makers go for that strategy and others will opt for the more fashionable, recognizable, sexual and idealized body. Sometimes they also choose a slightly more surprising route, and this is Noon Passama using an androgynous body. And this is me using a friend for a piece called Hello, My Name is W. So I thought that using that particular model helped the purpose of the piece.
So this all begs a number of questions. What does it mean if we assume the body is the natural site for jewelry? Whose body? Which body? From where is the body originating are questions that still need to be explored. How do we address the male body versus the female body in terms of contemporary jewelry? For example, bringing conceptual explorations of hip-hop culture and the dookie chain are ways of bringing out male identity, wealth in terms of what is worn, and a reclamation in some of the ways in which the chains that we showed you at the very beginning weigh down a woman or the image of a slave. How do we contend with the body over time? Dressing up as a little girl in our mother's and grandmother's jewelry, where jewelry becomes a marker of age and rites of passage at various points. Jewelry that functions as a signifier for identity, differentiation from a mother and parents, and then, looking back on it, how do we understand how to engage that as adults later in our lives?
So through these 4 keywords and 3 spaces, I think we wanted to highlight how the spaces of jewelry are both inherited and produced. This is where we expect to find jewelry. We expect to find it on the page, in the street, in the shop. But this is also how jewelers rework their heritage and redefine what they do. So I was speaking 2 days ago with Sandra Sherman, the head of the department at San Diego State University, and she was saying, so you've shown us some installation work, some photography. What actually constitutes this as jewelry? Is it still jewelry if someone is just exhibiting photograph, like Lauren Kalman, for example? So the answer to that question may be part intentionality, so the declaration of intent from the maker, and whether that maker is using as his primary reference the jewelry conventions. But like all forms of art, there is something performative about declaring yourself a contemporary jeweler. It is, at the end of the day, jewelry if you'd want it to be. And so this is not something that's reducible to a true or false proposition. It's not a matter of let the public decide or, history will tell us. It's still very much, and this is specific, I think, to the contemporary jewelry field, very much in the hands of makers and curators and writers to define what it is. And so this is why we wanted to use this as the last image of this presentation. It's Rauschenberg was asked in the 60s to send a portrait for an exhibition in Paris, and he sent this telegram saying, this is a portrait of Iris Claire, if I say so. And I think contemporary jewelry, and this is in any way the sort of the anchor or the foundation of this book, or what we wrote for this book, is the fact that we are actively contributing to defining this field now.
Thank you.
An hour 30.
I know. I knew it was going to go a little longer. It went a little longer than we meant it to. I know you guys have been here quite a long time. Do you want to ask us a few questions before you go? Does anybody want to, maybe one or two, and then we can move to a book signing? Yeah? Great. Do you have the microphone, Anna? No? Oh, Bobby's got it. Sorry, I heard yeah, but I didn't see where
We're
that was
just
coming
showing
from.
quotes from the book. You don't need to.
Testing. Oh, and look at this. My God. Okay,
Give me a bit of water.
so pardon the rambling question, but I mean, a lot of us here have made or are jewelers and have made other stuff too. So I can't help but extrapolate a lot of the things you guys were talking about to other parts of craft in general. So when you guys were talking about value and perceived value, how can you shifting from a material value to a value of the gesture, which is, I guess, to say a gesture within a cultural context at the time. How do you preserve value when value is a cultural gesture and kind of inherently a temporal gesture? You guys kind of put forward that skill was part of that, and skill was kind of an antidote to, like, a lasting part of an object or a jewelry object. But is there anything else that is sort of an antidote to a temporal situation?
I'm going to pretend I understand the question.
Sorry.
I think, no, just to clarify, I think when we speak about the gesture, we're speaking about the artistic gesture, and I think the slide that Namita showed about the Duchamp fountain is typically that gesture. Someone who says, this is art, because it's shifting the way we look at things and that reality, and it's shifting the way we perceive the encounter with the art object. So this is a gesture which has very little to do with making skills. And so far, it's been pretty sort of resistant to the test of time. And so the fact that it's a conceptual move, if you want, for me doesn't mean that it's going to be short-lasting or short-living. Although we know that, cultural objects come out and in and out of favor, as do skill.
And it actually makes me think about two pieces in particular. It makes me think about the question of trace. There's some kind of a trace with Gabriel Craig's Pro Bono Jeweler project. Is everyone familiar with Pro Bono Jeweler? No? So what Gabriel Craig did is he took a jeweler's bench out onto the street or under a parking structure, various places around different cities, and set up his workbench. And as passers-by came by, he engaged them, or they engaged him, in conversation about the fabrication of a silver ring. And so what ends up happening is then he shows them how a silver ring, a simple silver band, is made, and he gifts the silver ring to the person who came by. And the trace of this project, of the gesture that gets at these questions, is, he's got the bench as a marker of his skill. Mm-hmm. He's using that bench, which is the jeweler's bench. He also is documenting it through photography. And then he also has an object that then remains or is given and enters into a gift economy in a different sort of way. So there's still something there that's tracing that gesture in some regard. So I guess the question is how you document those gestures, for me, is an important thing. It also is making me think about Lauren Kallman's piece where she gilds her tongue.
Certainly red. Certainly red.
Certainly red, and it's so.
Oh, no, sorry, you're talking about the
it's
lipstick one. Yeah, sorry.
No, the one with the tongue, where she gilds the tongue, and then she's got her tongue sticking out, and basically you watch her, and her tongue starts twitching, and you start to see that as soon as she pulls her tongue in, you no longer have access to that gold, to that item, and you just wait to see if she's going to bring her tongue in, and she starts twitching more and drooling. But the video functions as this record and this trace of the action that's all gesture. Does that get at some of what you were thinking about, or not quite? Sort of?
A little bit. Sort of. No, I mean, my wording is probably part of it, but how does it last past the gesture, beyond skill? I guess was the question, in less words.
Does it last past the gesture?
What lasts past the gesture beyond skill?
Is a gesture sometimes enough?
Well, I don't know, but what maintains? Is the
I think there's so many people now going in a direction of object-less practices in craft that we have to take this into consideration and acknowledge the fact that some people are not interested with leaving either traces or objects behind. And I like the fact that Namita argued that Gabriel Craig's did leave some traces, but there's a number of people who do not want that, are interested in the relational, to use another art historical sort of idea. And transferring that into the jewelry realm. And I think for these makers or in these practices, the object doesn't really, it would be cumbersome within their practice.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
I'm not saying it's good, it's just, it's the way, it's being reshaped
judgment.
now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And those kinds of practices are extremely hard to engage as a museum curator. If we're trying to bring them into the museum and they're that ephemeral. I mean, we experimented with Judy Lehman and Shannon Stratton's Gestures of Resistance, and the exhibition became this accumulation of several artists' projects. The challenge was if you came into the museum and no one was there, you didn't know how to enter into the conversation very easily. And so you felt like you had come after the Fluxus party had ended. And so, it was a challenge. And I loved that we experimented because it was pretty radical for a contemporary craft museum to engage those kinds of practices as something you might find in a more contemporary art institution. But at the same time, if the institution is there to try to connect the audience with the work, it becomes really problematic and challenging to explain when you just don't understand what's going on, and it requires so much mediation. So it's an interesting challenge. Maybe one more. Anybody else? Well, thank you all so much. Did I miss someone?
No.
Okay. Thank you all.